everybody. It's an amazing honor to be part of this great event this year, and it's a humbling experience being a judge, I guarantee you, reading the incredible work that you people do. And as the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. These days, there's an awful lot of rhyming going on. In fact, this past Sunday, March the 25th, the Hillman Foundation set out a series of tweets saying that we were marking the 117th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in Greenwich Village, New York City, a blaze that killed 146 garment workers and set into motion the inquiries and the actions that ultimately led to the New Deal and changed the face of America. Sidney Hillman moved from Chicago to New York City in 1914 to be part of that work. And he worked with only a few dozen people. And these people resolved to forge change from the ashes of the Triangle Fire in an era of ruthless industrial competition, 1914. The experiences that they celebrated and rose up to be able to forge and chisel change out of the raw material they had in front of them were the voices of new immigrants and young women, the most vulnerable workers in society, and those were the unlikely people that shaped the future. Now, the next honorable mention echoes that precise history. The price of oil saw dozens of journalists in Canada from 3 different news organizations, 4 different universities with schools of journalism, and a think tank join forces to expose toxic practices that fuel Canada's vaunted $45 billion oil and gas industry every day. In an era of starving newsrooms and unimaginably fat cat corporations, these people pooled their resources, their talents, their energy across these institutions to raise the voices of people who are so very rarely heard from. Small, vulnerable communities in Saskatchewan and in Sarnia, literally struggling for their lives and their livelihoods. The price of oil traces a storyline whose contours are becoming alarmingly familiar in a range of industries and places in this era of sloth that we are in, that's slow or no growth. Like 100 years ago, our businesses are fighters. They're increasingly ruthless about flaunting the rules, willing to use their money to silence dissent and influence outcomes. Like 100 years ago, governments are only likely to rein in the excesses of the economy's biggest, most productive players when they're embarrassed into action. And in 2017, this cast of characters from these different papers and universities is exactly what what they accomplished, sorry. This is the largest collaborative journalism project of its kind in Canadian history. We're talking about over 50 journalists, editors, students, and teachers, and a Michener Fellow also, spending over 2 years exposing the toxic truth about how Canada's hugely profitable oil and gas industry works, while our governments look the other way, or worse. In Saskatchewan, that team revealed that provincial regulators who actually knew what was going on and proposed cracking down on toxic emissions were either fired or shuffled to a new position. The Price of Oil series documented years of illness and death from toxic leaks that continue today. Not a single company in Saskatchewan has been fined. In Ontario, as you just heard, the team showed how both Imperial Oil and the Ontario government tried to silence the First Nation of Amjinnan in Sarnia. These people are surrounded by what's known as Chemical Valley. You heard about the 500 environmental incident reports, only 4 cases resulting in charges. This reporting put the government of Ontario in the spotlight in a very unpleasant way for a couple of weeks, and that's all it took for them to agree to at least study the impact of the industry on the health of this First Nations community, something that these people had been asking for 10 years. And more of them are falling ill and developing cancer still today. This isn't about oil spills. We talk about oil spills all the time. This is about how business is conducted day in, day out with botched safety audits and regulatory infractions. 100 years ago, the sweatshop owners of the Triangle factory were charged with manslaughter, and not a single person was convicted. 100 years later, we are fighting exactly the same forces and being told we have to choose between our jobs and our health. At a time when workers, communities, and journalism itself is struggling to survive, the innovative and inspiring teamwork behind the price of oil offers hope that we can overcome bad corporate behavior by joining our forces. Please help me welcome to the stage the cast of thousands.
Clearly, when people talk about the price of oil, they talk about scale. 60 now, well, approaching 60, maybe more than 60 journalists, all the news organizations, all the universities, the largest collaboration. That's a lot of people, but what's so much more interesting is how they did it. So I was chosen to speak on behalf of the group because of my role as, we're going to call it coordinator. There's not really a term for what I do, the finder of consensus. So I'm here from New York. I moved there after for grad school, and I ended up staying. I have to tell you that what struck me as a longtime New Yorker now is just how well all these people got along. So when the project was launched, we knew that we had to have a lot of reporters if we were going to be reporting on oil. So we called up all the organizations, and I'm going to try and mention them all. Global News, National Observer, Toronto Star, Concordia University, Ryerson University, UBC, University of Regina, Michener Foundation, of course, and the Corporate Mapping Project, all 9. And there was no negotiating, no bargaining. They all just said yes. I called up Trish Elliott here from University of Regina, and I said, so how about we engage in a long-term project? Don't know what the outcome will be. It'll take most of your time. And she said, yeah, just like that. It was really that easy. So we got to work, all of us, and so as a New Yorker, I was struck by how often these people said, I'm sorry. So we're working away, and they'd start a sentence with, I'm sorry. They'd end a sentence with, I'm sorry, like beginning and end, especially when they were negotiating. And but they all got along, they'd get on with it. So that was great. And sure enough, the reporting is coming along, and we started uncovering these stories, these heartbreaking stories about emissions in toxic, cancer-causing emissions in Ontario and Saskatchewan that were affecting workers and rural residents. And what was heartbreaking was how frightened people were of speaking to us. They were afraid of repercussions from their employers or from their neighbors. And this is not how Canadians should be. These are people who had their health affected themselves, their loved ones, and they were afraid to speak out. And what was striking was the determination of all these people to tell those stories. So universities, news organizations, students, professionals, so many students, they were so dedicated and so united in that purpose of serving these people who didn't have the power to tell their stories themselves, and doing it carefully and maintaining the privacy and protections that they needed. I'm going to speak as a New Yorker just for a second. I'm not really all that apologetic all the time. And so I have a little bit of boasting to do. I think that what other nations read as politeness is actually the Canadian constant recognition of a deep sense of community. I think that Canadians have an incredible, unusual, unique talent for collaboration that's unmatched anywhere else.